Part 1. The Rise of China. The biggest player in the history of the world. You have no idea what sort of people the Athenians are. They are always thinking of new schemes and are quick to carry them out. They make a plan. If it succeeds, the success is nothing in comparison to what they are going to do next. Thucydides, Corinthian ambassador, addresses the Spartan assembly, 432 BCE. Let China sleep. When she wakes, she will shake the world. Napoleon, 1817. Shortly after he became director of the Central Intelligence Agency in September 2011, I went to see America's most successful modern general in his office in Langley, Virginia. David Petraeus and I had first met in the 1980s when he was a doctoral student at Princeton and I was dean of Harvard Kennedy School. We had stayed in touch ever since, as he rose through the ranks of the U.S. Army, and I continued my academic work while also serving several tours in the Pentagon. After some preliminary discussion about his new job, I asked David whether the old hands at the agency had begun opening for him some of the secret jewel boxes, the files containing the deepest, most heavily classified secrets of the U.S. government. He smiled knowingly and said, "You bet," but then waited for me to say more. After a pause, I asked what he had learned about deep sleepers, individuals with whom the agency had established a relationship, but whose assignment essentially consisted of going to live and prosper in a foreign country so as to develop a full understanding of its culture, people, and government. With a commitment to be helpful to their careers in unseen ways, the agency only asked of these individuals that, when called upon, unobtrusively, perhaps just once or twice in a decade, they would provide their candid insights into what was happening in the country and what was likely to happen in the future. David was by this point leaning forward across the table as I opened a report from someone whose incisive, far-sighted understanding could inform Washington's response to the greatest geopolitical challenge of our lifetime. As I said to the new director, this individual had succeeded beyond all expectations. He had seen up close China's convulsions, from the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution in the 1960s to Deng Xiaoping's capitalist pivot in the 1980s. Indeed, he had established serious working relationships with many of the people who governed China, including China's future president, Xi Jinping. I began reading the first set of questions from 50 pages of Q, and with this asset. Are China's current leaders serious about displacing the United States as the #1 power in Asia in the foreseeable future? What is China's strategy for becoming #1? What are the major hurdles to China's executing its strategy? How likely is China to succeed? If it does succeed, what will be the consequences for its neighbors in Asia? For the U.S.? Is conflict between China and the U.S. inevitable? This individual had provided invaluable answers to these questions and many more. He had pulled the curtain back on the thinking of the Chinese leadership. He had soberly assessed the risk that these two countries might someday violently collide, and he had given actionable intelligence that could help prevent the unthinkable from happening. Lee Kuan Yew was, of course, no CIA spy. His mind, heart, and soul belonged to Singapore. But the longtime statesman, who died in 2015, was a font of wisdom hiding in plain sight. The report I gave to David was a sneak preview of Lee Kuan Yew, the Grand Master's insights on China, the United States, and the world, a book that I co-authored in 2013 with Robert Blackwell and Ollie Wine. As the founder and long-serving leader of that tiny city-state, Lee took a small, poor, inconsequential fishing village and raised it to become a modern megalopolis. Ethnically Chinese, he was educated at Cambridge University and embodied a fusion of Confucian and upper-class English values. And until his death in 2015, he was also unquestionably the world's premier China watcher. Lee's insights into what was happening in China, as well as the wider world, made him a sought-after strategic counselor to presidents and prime ministers on every continent, including every American head of state from Richard Nixon to Barack Obama. His keen understanding of China reflected not only his singular strategic acumen, as Henry Kissinger called it, but also his intense need to know as much as he could about this sleeping giant. Though its economic and political might was not so obvious amid Mao's agrarian Marxism, China was nevertheless a colossus in whose shadow Lee's island nation struggled for enough sunlight to survive. Lee was one of the first to see China's true nature and its full potential. Uniquely, as Lee studied China and its leaders, they also studied him and his country. In the late 1970s, when Deng began to think about leading China on a fast march to the market, Chinese leaders looked to Singapore as a laboratory in not only economic, but also political development. Lee spent thousands of hours in direct conversations with Chinese presidents, prime ministers, cabinet officers, and rising leaders of his neighbor to the north. Every Chinese leader from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping has called him mentor, a term of ultimate respect in Chinese culture. My biggest takeaway from Li for the new CIA director addresses the most troubling question about China's trajectory. What does its dramatic transformation mean for the global balance of power? Li answered pointedly, the size of China's displacement of the world balance is such that the world must find a new balance. It is not possible to pretend that this is just another big player. This is the biggest player in the history of the world. Could the US become number 2? In my national security course at Harvard, my lecture on China begins with a quiz. The first question asks students to compare China and the United States in 1980 with their current rankings. Repeatedly, students are shocked at what they see. One glance at the chart with numbers from 2015 should explain why. In a single generation, a nation that did not appear on any of the international league tables has vaulted into the top spot. In 1980, China's gross domestic product GDP was less than $300 billion. By 2015, it was $11 trillion, making it the world's second largest economy by market exchange rates. In 1980, China's trade with the outside world amounted to less than $40 billion. By 2015, it had increased 100-fold to $4 trillion. For every 2-year period since 2008, the increment of growth in China's GDP has been larger than the entire economy of India. Even at its lower growth rate in 2015, China's economy created a Greece every 16 weeks and an Israel every 25 weeks. During its own remarkable progress, between 1860 and 1913, when the United States shocked European capitals by surpassing Great Britain to become the world's largest economy, America's annual growth averaged 4.6%. Since 1980, China's economy has grown at 10% a year. According to the rule of 72, divide 72 by the annual growth rate to determine when an economy or investment will double. The Chinese economy has doubled every 7 years. To appreciate how remarkable this is, we need a longer timeline. In the 18th century, Britain gave birth to the Industrial Revolution, creating what we now know as the modern world. In 1776, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations to explain how, after millennia of poverty, market capitalism was creating wealth and a new middle class. 17 years later, an emissary from King George Roman III, the same mad King George who lost the Revolutionary War to the US, arrived in China to propose establishing relations between the two nations. At that moment, British workers were massively more productive than their Chinese counterparts. The Chinese were many, as they had been over the centuries, but they were poor. At the end of each day of labor, a Chinese worker had produced barely enough to feed himself and his family, leaving relatively little surplus for the state to pay soldiers or invest in armaments like a navy, which over 4 millennia Chinese emperors never did, bar one brief half-century exception to project power far beyond its borders. Today, workers in China are 1/4 as productive as their American counterparts. If over the next decade or two they become just half as productive as Americans, China's economy will be twice the size of the US economy. If they equal American productivity, China will have an economy 4 times that of the US. This elementary arithmetic poses a fundamental problem for Washington's effort to rebalance China's growing weight. In 2011, with considerable fanfare, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton announced an important pivot in American foreign policy, redirecting Washington's attention and resources from the Middle East to Asia. In President Obama's words, after a decade in which we fought 2 wars that cost us dearly in blood and treasure, the U.S. is turning our attention to the vast potential of the Asia-Pacific region. He promised to increase America's diplomatic, economic, and military presence in the Asia-Pacific, and signaled the U.S. determination to counter the impact of China's rise in the region. President Obama has featured this rebalance as one of the major foreign policy achievements of his administration. As Assistant Secretary of State under Obama and Secretary Clinton, Kurt Campbell led this initiative. His 2016 book, The Pivot: The Future of American Statecraft in Asia, makes the best possible case for the Great Rebalance as more than aspiration. Despite his best efforts, however, he is unable to find many metrics to support his thesis. Measured in attention span of the president, time spent at National Security Council principals and deputies meetings, face time with leaders of the region, sorties flown, hours of ships on station, and dollars allocated, the pivot is hard to find. Ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, combined with new wars in Syria and against ISIS across the Middle East, to monopolize the administration's foreign policy agenda and dominate the president's days over his 8 years in office. As one Obama White House official recalled, "It never felt like we pivoted away from the Middle East. About 80% of our main meetings at the National Security Council have focused on the Middle East." Even if American attention had not been focused elsewhere, Washington would have struggled to defy the laws of economic gravity. Compare the relative weight of the U.S. and Chinese economies as if they were two competitors on opposite ends of a seesaw. The conclusion is as obvious as it is painful. Americans have been debating whether they should put less weight on their left foot, the Middle East, in order to put more weight on their right, Asia. Meanwhile, China has just kept growing at 3 times the U.S. rate. As a result, America's side of the seesaw has tilted to the point that soon both feet will be dangling entirely off the ground. This is the subtext of the first question on my class quiz. The second question pricks more delusions. It asks students, when might the U.S. actually find itself number 2? In what year might China overtake the United States to become the number 1 auto market, the biggest market for luxury goods, or even the largest economy in the world? Full stop. Most students are stunned to learn that on most indicators, China has already surpassed the United States. As the largest producer of ships, steel, aluminum, furniture, clothing, textiles, cell phones, and computers, China has become the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. Students are even more surprised to discover that China has also become the world's largest consumer of most products. America was the birthplace of the automobile, but China is now both the largest automaker and the largest auto market. Chinese consumers bought 20 million cars in 2015, 3 million more than were sold in the US. China is also the world's largest market for cell phones and e-commerce and has the largest number of internet users. China imported more oil, consumed more energy, and installed more solar power than any other nation. Perhaps most devastatingly for America's self-conception, in 2016, as it has since the 2008 worldwide financial crisis, China continued to serve as the primary engine of global economic growth. But that's impossible. For Americans who grew up in a world in which USA meant number 1, and that would be every citizen since roughly 1870, the idea that China could unseat the US as the world's largest economy is unthinkable. Many Americans imagine that economic primacy is an unalienable right to the point that it has become part of their national identity. America's attachment to its position atop the world helps explain the firestorm that erupted at the International Monetary Fund/World Bank meeting in Washington in 2014 when the IMF issued its annual report on the global economy. As the press reported the headline, America is now no. 2. In Market Watch's shout-out, there's no easy way to say this, so I'll just say it. We're no longer no. 1. 16 more summarily, as the Financial Times summarized the IMF's message, now it is official. In 2014, the IMF estimates the size of the U.S. economy was $17.4 trillion and the size of China's economy was $17.6 trillion. The FT went on to note that as recently as 2005, China's economy was less than half the size of the U.S. By 2009, the IMF expects it to be 20% bigger. The IMF had measured China's GDP using the yardstick of purchasing power parity, or PPP, which is the standard now used by the major international institutions whose professional responsibilities require them to compare national economies. As the CIA puts it, PPP provides the best available starting point for comparisons of economic strength and well-being between countries. The IMF explains that market rates are more volatile, and using them can produce quite large swings in aggregate measures of growth even when growth rates in individual countries are stable. PPP is generally regarded as a better measure of overall well-being. Measured by purchasing power parity, China has not only surpassed the US, but also now accounts for roughly 18% of world GDP, compared to just 2% in 1980. Among those for whom American primacy is an article of faith, the IMF announcement stimulated a vigorous search for metrics by which the US is still number 1. These include GDP per capita, new data that take better account of quality of life and well-being, and new rationales for the previous standard that measured GDP at market exchange rates. Since a number of my respected colleagues disagree, I asked the world's leading professor central banker, former MIT professor Stanley Fischer, how we should measure the US economy against China's. Fischer wrote the textbook on macroeconomics, taught Ben Bernanke, former head of the Federal Reserve System, and Mario Draghi, head of the European Central Bank, served as the chairman of the Central Bank of Israel, and now serves as the vice chairman of the US Fed. He knows whereof he speaks, and in his judgment, PPP truly is the best benchmark and not just for assessing relative economic strength. In comparing the size of national economies, he told me, especially for the purposes of assessing comparative military potential, as the first approximation, the best yardstick is PPP. This measures how many aircraft, missiles, ships, sailors, pilots, drones, bases, and other military-related items a state can buy and the prices it has to pay in its own national currency. The International Institute for Strategic Studies' authoritative annual The Military Balance concurs, noting that the arguments for using PPP are strongest for China and Russia. As I write this, the favorite storyline in the Western press about the Chinese economy is slowdown. A word cloud search of reports on the Chinese economy from 2013 to 2016 in the elite press finds that this is the most frequently used word to describe what is happening there. The question few pause to ask is, slowing compared to whom? Over this same period, the American press's favorite adjective to describe American economic performance has been recovering. But compare China's slowdown with America's recovery. Has China slowed to about the same growth rate as the U.S.? A little bit higher? Or a lot more? To be sure, since the financial crisis and Great Recession of 2008, the Chinese economy has indeed slowed, from an average of 10% in the decade prior to 2008 to the current 6 to 7% annually in 2015 and 2016. But while Chinese economic growth has declined by approximately one-third from the pre-crisis level, global economic growth has been cut nearly in half. The recovering U.S. economy has averaged just 2.1% growth annually in the years since the Great Recession. The EU economies, meanwhile, have grown by 1.3% annually since then and continue to stagnate. The same is true of Japan, which has averaged just 1.2% growth during this period. 24 For all the noise about the Chinese economic slowdown, remember one incandescent fact: since the Great Recession, 40% of all the growth around the world has occurred in just one country, China. Could Rome be built in 2 weeks? In 1980, American visitors to China were rare. The country had only recently opened to the West, and travel was still difficult. Those who went found a country that looked as if it had been plucked from the distant past. Vast, rural, unchanging, inscrutable, asleep. They saw bamboo houses and crumbling Soviet-style apartment blocks, and city streets crowded only with throngs of bicycles, their riders wearing nearly identical drab mouse suits. Tourists who ventured across the water from Hong Kong saw the empty fields of Guangzhou and Shenzhen dotted with tiny villages. Wherever they went, Americans encountered grinding poverty, 88% of China's 1 billion citizens struggling to survive as they had for millennia before the Industrial Revolution on less than $2 a day. 26 The once empty streets of Beijing are now clogged with 6 million automobiles. Looking back on his secret diplomatic mission to China in the early 1970s, Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State who played a key role in reopening China to the West, said, remembering China in 1971, "If anyone had shown me a picture of what Beijing looks like and said in 25 years, Beijing will look like this, I would have said that's absolutely impossible." The village of Shenzhen is today a megacity of more than 10 million people, with real estate prices that rival Silicon Valley's. Former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, an astute China watcher, has described the country's explosion as the English Industrial Revolution and the Global Information Revolution combusting simultaneously and compressed into not 300 years but 30. When Americans complain about how long it takes to build a building or repair a road, authorities often reply that Rome was not built in a day. Someone clearly forgot to tell the Chinese. By 2025, the country was building the square-foot equivalent of today's Rome every 2 weeks. Between 2011 and 2013, China both produced and used more cement than the U.S. did in the entire 20th century. In 2011, a Chinese firm built a 30-story skyscraper in just 15 days. 3 years later, another construction firm built a 57-story skyscraper in 19 days. Indeed, China built the equivalent of Europe's entire housing stock in just 15 years. When he first saw the massive, beautifully appointed Tianjin Meijiang Convention and Exhibition Center, which hosted the 2010 World Economic Forum Summer Conference, New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman confessed to having gasped, "It was built in just 8 months." Friedman noted the feat with amazement, but also dismay. It took almost as long for a Washington Metro crew to repair 2 tiny escalators of 21 steps, each at a red line station near his home in Maryland. Friedman devotes an entire chapter of his book Hot, Flat, and Crowded to a fantasy about the far-reaching reforms the United States could enact if only it were China for a day. Today China is doing in hours what it takes years to accomplish in the U.S. I have been reminded of this daily when I see the bridge over the Charles River between my office at Harvard Kennedy School and Harvard Business School. It has been under reconstruction, snarling traffic, for 4 years. In November 2015, Beijing replaced the substantially larger Y300-ton Sanyuan Bridge in just 43 hours. Overall, China built 2.6 million miles of roads, including 70,000 miles of highways between 1996 and 2016, connecting 95% of the country's villages and overtaking the U.S. as the country with the most extensive highway system by almost 50%. Over the past decade, China has constructed the world's longest high-speed rail network, 12,000 miles of rail lines that carry passengers between cities at speeds of up to 180 miles per hour. In the U.S., that much new track would stretch from New York to California and back twice. At 180 mph, one could go from Grand Central Terminal in New York City to Union Station in D.C. in just over an hour, from Boston to Washington in 2. Indeed, China now has more high-speed rail tracks than the rest of the world combined. During this same decade, California has been struggling mightily to build a single 520-mile high-speed connection between Los Angeles and San Francisco. Voters approved the project in 2008, but this state recently admitted it will not be finished until 2029, at a cost of $68 billion 9 years later and $35 billion more than was originally promised. By then, China plans to have completed another 16,000 miles of high-speed rail connections. Beyond the skyscrapers, bridges, and fast trains lies the far more profound impact of China's human development. A generation ago, 90 out of every 100 Chinese lived on less than $2 a day. Today, fewer than 3 in 1.40 average per capita income has risen from $1.93 in 1980 to over $8 in money today. In assessing progress toward the UN's Millennium Development Goals for improving the lives of the world's poorest people, World Bank President Robert Zoellick noted in 2010, between 1981 and 2004, China succeeded in lifting more than 500 million people out of extreme poverty. This is certainly the greatest leap to overcome poverty in history. China's education, healthcare, and related indicators reflect similar improvements in its people's well-being. In 1949, Chinese citizens could expect to die at the age of 36, and 8 in 10 could not read or write. By 2014, life expectancy had more than doubled to 76, and 95% are literate. 43 If China continues on its current growth path, millions of individuals will experience a 100-fold increase in living standards over their lifetimes. At the average per capita growth rate in the U.S. over the past decade, Americans will have to wait 740 years to see an equivalent improvement. As The Economist has repeatedly explained to its readers, for the first time in modern history, Asia is now richer than Europe in terms of accumulated private wealth. Asia is expected to surpass North America around 2020, with China as the main driver of wealth accumulation, which includes total financial assets across households. In the blink of history's eye, China's economic growth has not only raised hundreds of millions from poverty, but also produced an extraordinary number of millionaires and billionaires. By one count, China surpassed the United States as the country with the most billionaires in 2015 and is now adding a new billionaire every week. And while Chinese are among the most aggressive savers in the world, families typically save over 30% of their disposable income. One can hardly imagine what Karl Marx would say if he knew how many Chinese communists are wearing Prada today. Chinese shoppers bought half of the world's luxury goods sold in 2015.46 Louis Vuitton, Chanel, and Gucci now see Chinese as their primary customers. Sotheby's and Christie's highest-priced auctions are no longer held in New York and London, but in Beijing and Shanghai. The STEM revolution. A generation ago, China stood at the bottom of most international rankings of nations in education, science, technology, and innovation. But after 2 decades of determined investment in the country's human capital, it has become a global competitor. Today it rivals, and by some measures outperforms, the United States. The internationally recognized gold standard for comparing education performance among high school students is the Program for International Student Assessment. On the 2015 PISA test, China ranked 6th in mathematics while the United States ranked 39th. China's score was well above the OECD average, while the U.S. score was significantly below. Even the highest-rated American state, Massachusetts, would stand just 20th if it were measured as its own country in the rankings, a drop from its 9th-place rating when the test was last conducted in 2012. According to the most recent Stanford University comparison of students entering college in the fields of engineering and computer science, Chinese high school graduates arrive with a 3-year advantage over their American counterparts in critical thinking skills. In 2015, Tsinghua University passed MIT in the U.S. News and World Report rankings to become the #1 university in the world for engineering. Among the top 10 schools of engineering, China and the U.S. each had 4. In STEM subjects science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, which provide the core competencies driving advances in science, technology, and the fastest-growing sectors of modern economies, China annually graduates 4 times as many students as the U.S. 1.3 million vs. 300,000. And that does not include an additional 300,000 Chinese students currently enrolled in U.S. institutions. This gap has persisted for a decade despite the Obama administration's celebrated Educate to Innovate initiative to promote STEM education, launched in 2009. In every year of the Obama administration, Chinese universities awarded more PhDs in STEM fields than American universities. The impact of China's investments in education is already evident across the Chinese economy. Long known primarily as a low-cost producer of inexpensive consumer goods, China has seen its share of total global value weighted in high-tech manufacturing increase from 7% in 2003 to 27% in 2014. The U.S. National Science Foundation report that documented this growth also finds that over that same decade, the American share of this market declined from 36% to 29%. For example, in the fast-moving field of robotics, in 2015 China not only registered twice as many applications for new patents, but also added 2.5 times as many industrial robots to its workforce. 53 China is now the world leader in producing computers, semiconductors, and communications equipment, as well as pharmaceuticals. 54 In 2015, Chinese filed almost twice as many total patent applications as the second-place Americans and became the first country to generate more than 1 million applications in a single year. On its current path, China will surpass the U.S. to become the world leader in research and development spending by 2019.56, as a 2014 American Academy of Arts and Sciences study warns. If our nation does not act quickly to shore up its scientific enterprise, it will squander the advantage it has long held as an engine of innovation that generates new discoveries and stimulates job growth. In response to these trends, many Americans have sought refuge in the belief that for all its size and bluster, China's success is still essentially a story of imitation and mass production. This view has some grounding in reality, theft of intellectual property both in the old-fashioned way, with spies, and increasingly by exploiting cyber methods as well has been another key part of China's economic development program. As a Chinese colleague once explained to me, what Americans call R&D research and development, Chinese think of as RD&T, where the T stands for theft. Of course, China only targets nations that have intellectual property worth stealing, the most important being the United States. The amount of theft that's going on is simply staggering, FBI Director James Comey said in 2014. There's only 2 types of big corporations in America: those who have been hacked by the Chinese, or those who don't yet know they've been hacked by the Chinese. A 2016 investigation by CBS's 60 Minutes reported that China's corporate espionage has cost American companies hundreds of billions of dollars, leading a top Justice Department official to call Chinese cyber theft a serious threat to our national security. Though it remains a hotbed of cyber piracy and corporate spying, with each passing year it is getting harder to dismiss China's growing power as an innovator in its own right. Consider supercomputers, which the White House Office of Science and Technology singled out as essential to economic competitiveness, scientific discovery, and national security. To ensure that the U.S. could sustain its leadership position in supercomputing, President Obama established the National Strategic Computing Initiative in 2015 as a pillar of his strategy for American innovation. But since June 2013, the world's fastest supercomputer has been located not in Silicon Valley, but in China. Indeed, in the rankings of the world's 500 fastest supercomputers, a list from which China was absent in 2001, today it has 167, 2 more than the United States. Moreover, China's top supercomputer is 5 times faster than the closest American competitor. And while China's supercomputers previously relied heavily on American processors, its top computer in 2016 was built entirely with domestic processors. 2 further 2016 breakthroughs in China provide troubling pointers to the future: the launch of the world's first quantum communications satellite, designed to provide an unprecedented scope of hack-proof communications, and completion of the largest radio telescope on Earth, a device that has an unmatched capacity to search deep space for intelligent life. Each of these achievements demonstrates China's ability to undertake costly, long-term, path-breaking projects and see them through to successful completion. capability that has atrophied in the U.S., as demonstrated by the failure of multiple recent multi-billion-dollar investments in megaprojects, from plutonium reprocessing at Savannah River in South Carolina facing cancellation, despite $5 billion in taxpayer expenditures, after a recent estimate stated that the project would cost $1 billion annually and last decades, to what MIT called the flagship carbon capture and storage project at Kemper County, Mississippi $4 billion in cost overruns, recently delayed by over 2 years, and facing an uncertain future. Bigger barrels of bigger guns. While GDP is not the only measure of a country's rise, it provides the substructure of national power. And while GDP does not translate instantly or automatically into economic or military strength, if history is our guide, nations with larger GDPs over time have proportionally greater influence in shaping international affairs. Chinese never forget Mao's dictum: power grows out of the barrel of a gun. They know that the Communist Party governs China, rather than successors of Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang, for one and only one reason. Mao and his fighting comrades won the Civil War, when in 1989 students and their supporters rose up in Tiananmen Square to protest, who crushed them to keep the communist authorities in power. Chinese soldiers with guns and tanks. As China's economy has gotten bigger, its guns and tanks and their 21st century equivalents have gotten better and allowed for a new level of competition with other great powers, especially the United States. Just as technology startups like Facebook and Uber have used the concept of disruptive innovation to upend previously dominant firms, the Chinese military is developing new technologies that can counter ships, planes, and satellites that the U.S. has developed over decades and for a fraction of the cost. Today, states playing catch-up need not replicate investments that their competitors made in hardware and other legacy platforms. New technologies allow for asymmetric responses, like missiles that can be launched from the Chinese mainland to destroy aircraft carriers, or anti-satellite weapons that for $1 million can destroy a multi-billion-dollar U.S. satellite. Although it has devoted on average just 2% of its GDP to defense since the late 1980s, the U.S. has spent closer to 4%. 3 decades of double-digit economic growth have allowed Chinese military capabilities to expand eightfold. Today its defense budget of $146 billion in market exchange rates or $314 billion in PPP ranks second only to that of the US, and is twice Russia's. China's growing military might will be discussed in greater detail in Chapter 6. For now, suffice it to say that China has already secured a number of advantages on the battlefield. The most authoritative assessment of the changing balance of military power in the region is a 2015 Rand Corporation study called the U.S. China Military Scorecard. The report finds that, by 2017, China will have an advantage or approximate parity in 6 of the 9 areas of conventional capability. For instance, in launching attacks on air bases or surface targets, achieving air superiority, and preventing an opponent from using space-based weapons. The report concludes that over the next 5 to 15 years, Asia will witness a progressively receding frontier of U.S. dominance. Like its economic progress, China's military advances are rapidly undercutting America's status as a global hegemon and are forcing U.S. leaders to confront ugly truths about the limits of American power. The new balance of power. While serving as Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton once suggested that in the 21st century the concept of balance of power was obsolete. Lee Kuan Yew disagreed. He saw the idea as a fundamental building block in understanding relations among nations. But he explained, in the old concept, balance of power meant largely military power. In today's terms, it is a combination of economic and military, and I think the economic outweighs the military. This new balance of power has been called by another name, geoeconomics, which is the use of economic instruments from trade and investment policy to sanctions, cyber attacks, and foreign aid to achieve geopolitical goals. Robert Blackwell and Jennifer Harris explore the concept in their 2016 book, War by Other Means: Geoeconomics and Statecraft. They argue that China is the world's leading practitioner of geoeconomics, but it has also been perhaps the major factor in returning regional or global power projection back to an importantly economic as opposed to politico-military exercise. China primarily conducts foreign policy through economics because, to put it bluntly, it can. It is currently the largest trading partner for over 130 countries, including all the major Asian economies. Its trade with members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations accounted for 15% of ASEAN total trade in 2015, while the U.S. accounted for only 9%. This imbalance will accelerate in the absence of the Trans-Pacific Partnership as China moves quickly to establish its own equivalent in an emerging co-prosperity area. This geo-economic strategy harks back to Sun Tzu's maxim: ultimate excellence lies not in winning every battle, but in defeating the enemy without ever fighting. As Henry Kissinger's on China explains, victory for Sun Tzu was not simply the triumph of armed forces, but the achievement of the ultimate political objectives that a military clash would be intended to secure. Far better than challenging the enemy on the field of battle is maneuvering him into an unfavorable position from which escape is impossible. In economic relations today, China is doing just that. Of course, mastery in international affairs requires more than just economic leverage. A government must have not only the economic heft, but also the skill to wield economic instruments effectively. Here China has demonstrated a unique mastery in using hard instruments of soft power. When parties are slow to recognize reality or determined to resist, China is ready to use the carrots and sticks of its economic power: buying, selling, sanctioning, investing, bribing, and stealing as needed until they fall into line. Nations that have become dependent on China's supply of key imports and on Chinese markets for their exports are particularly vulnerable. When disagreements arise, China simply delays the first and blocks the second. Notable cases include China's abrupt cessation of all exports of rare metals to Japan in 2010 to persuade Japan to return several Chinese fishermen it had detained, its zeroing out of salmon purchases from what had been Norway's #1 market in 2011 to punish Norway for the Nobel Peace Prize Committee's selection of a noted Chinese dissident, Liu Xiaobo, and its prolonged inspection of bananas from the Philippines until they had rotted on the docks in 2012 to change the Filipino government's calculations about a dispute over Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea. China enjoys such superiority in its balance of economic power that many other states have no realistic option but to comply with its wishes, even when the international system is on their side. In 2016, for instance, China flatly rejected an unfavorable ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration over a dispute with the Philippines in the South China Sea, setting the table for another contest of wills. In this standoff and others involving the South China Sea, China has demonstrated an ability to combine charm, largesse, bribes, and blackmail to find compromises that give it most of what it wants. Better than bilateral bargaining, of course, are international institutions that give the designer the advantage. The United States led the way down this road in the aftermath of World War II when creating the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF to coordinate international finance, the World Bank to provide below-market rate loans to developing countries, and the GATT and its successor, the World Trade Organization, to promote trade. In both the IMF and the World Bank, one and only one country has a veto over any changes in governance of the institutions: the United States. Predictably, as China's economy has grown, its leaders have become unhappy with these inherited arrangements and have thus begun to forge new ones. After years of the United States refusing to accommodate China's request for a larger share of the votes at the World Bank, in 2013 Beijing stunned Washington by establishing its own competitive institution, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank (AIIB). Despite an intense campaign by Washington to pressure nations not to join China's bank, 57 signed up before it launched in 2015, including some of America's key allies, with the UK in the lead. They said no to the United States and yes to China in the hope of receiving loans at below-market rates and contracts for large construction projects funded by the bank. Their incentives were plain to see. Even before the AIIB was established, the China Development Bank had surpassed the World Bank as the biggest financer of international development projects. Including its commitment of $30 billion to the AIIB as starting capital, China's combined international development finance assets in 2016 were $130 billion, larger than those of the 6 major Western development banks combined. This was not the first time China decided to start its own club rather than play by the West's rules. In the aftermath of the financial crisis and Great Recession of 2008, China organized the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa as a group of rapidly expanding economies capable of making decisions and taking actions without supervision from the United States or the G7. After Vladimir Putin sent Russian troops into Ukraine in 2014, the United States and European Union disinvited him to what was supposed to have been a G8 meeting and declared him isolated. A month later, Xi Jinping and other leaders of the BRICS welcomed him with open arms at their summit. Other Chinese initiatives have had similar effects. In September 2013, Xi Jinping announced China's intention to invest $1.4 trillion in building a new Silk Road of infrastructure to link 65 countries in Asia, Europe, and North Africa with a combined population of 4.4 billion people. Through the Silk Road Economic Belt and 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, collectively known as One Belt, One Road, China is constructing a network of highways, fast railroads, airports, ports, pipelines, power transmission lines, and fiber optic cables across Eurasia. These modern physical links along what were once ancient Chinese trade routes will foster new diplomatic, trade, and financial ties. At this point, ABER includes 900 projects at a cost exceeding $1.4 trillion. Even after adjusting for inflation, this amounts to 12 Marshall Plans, according to the investor and former IMF economist Stephen Jen. Large S, economic imperialism, call it what you will. The fact is that China's economic network is spreading across the globe, altering the international balance of power in a way that causes even longtime U.S. allies in Asia to tilt from the U.S. toward China. In Li Kuan Yu's succinct summary, China is sucking the Southeast Asian countries into its economic system because of its vast market and growing purchasing power. Japan and South Korea will inevitably be sucked in as well. It just absorbs countries without having to use force. China's growing economic sway will be very difficult to fight. Or in the Chinese version of the Golden Rule, he who has the gold, rules. The implications of these developments for the relative position of China and the United States were captured memorably in a comment by one of America's wisest Asia hands. Having served for 3 decades in the U.S. government, including assignments as ambassador to both the Philippines and South Korea, in 1998 Stephen Bosworth was appointed Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. In the decade that followed, he shifted his focus away from Asia to commit himself fully to that educational institution. Then, in 2009, he was asked by President Obama to become his special envoy for North Korea. When he returned from an initial 2-week trip across the region after meeting with prime ministers and presidents, Bosworth reported that he could scarcely believe what he had seen. It was, he recalled, a Rip Van Winkle experience. In olden days, by which he meant before 1998, when a crisis or issue arose, the first question Asian leaders always asked was, "What does Washington think?" Today, when something happens, they ask first, "What does Beijing think?"